In this video, I want to summarise The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, published by Crossway in 2020. The subtitle is Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism and the Road to Sexual Revolution. The author is Carl Trueman, an English theologian and historian who has spent much of his life in the States. He's an ordained Presbyterian minister and taught at Westminster Seminary before becoming a professor at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. The book sets out to try and explain the modern world. How did we get to a situation where someone can say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, and for that to be accepted as nothing strange? Such a question would have been unthinkable to previous generations. The statement contains a number of assumptions: that inner conviction takes priority over biological reality, that gender is separate from sex, and that notions of civil rights and liberty are foundational. The book traces the historical and philosophical threads that have led us to this point today. But how far back do we need today? Do we need to go? Many would blame the sexual revolution of the 1960s as the root cause, but that doesn't go back far enough. Whilst it would be easy to blame the sexual revolution, Trueman argues that this is as much a symptom as a cause of the culture that we're now in. A culture where traditional moral teaching on sex is repudiated as a sign of mental deficiency, where any criticism of homosexuality is deemed to be homophobia, and where celibacy and chastity are more likely to be comedy material. Theologically, we probably need to go right back to the Garden of Eden, where the autonomous human self first appeared, but that doesn't explain the specific issues that we face today and how we got here. So part one of the book is labelled The Architecture of the Revolution and references some key thinkers to describe the reality that we see around us. Now, the first two chapters are quite hard going, but they do help to provide a language for describing the cultural change that is taking place. In chapter 1, Reimagining the Self, Trueman draws firstly on the work of sociologist Charles Taylor and his idea of the social imaginary. We've come to see the world not as a fixed order, but as raw material out of which we create meaning, aided by technology. Self-creation is part of the social imaginary now. Trueman also references Philip Rieff and his 1966 book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, where Rieff says that we have now entered the age of psychological man, which demands that the wider world must accept my identity. In chapter 2, Reimagining Our Culture, Trueman asks, why does our culture have the shape that it does? And why is sex so fundamental to identity? Rieff speaks about sacred order. Some societies justify their morality by appealing to something transcendent, like fate in the pagan world, or faith in the Christian world. But modern society seeks to justify itself. There is no sacred order, and Trueman says this is unprecedented in human history. Charles Taylor calls it the immanent frame. Such cultures are volatile and unstable, and moral matters are reduced to pragmatism. Will this make me happy? Will it hurt somebody else? And then Trueman introduces a third heavyweight thinker at this point, the ethicist Alistair MacIntyre, and his discussion of emotivism, where all judgments are nothing but expressions of preference based on feelings. The traditional moral order, the one that we've inherited from the Bible, must be overthrown and replaced. And Trueman comments on two key factors in this: the role of death works in art and historical forgetfulness. Death works ridicule and subvert old values. Pornography is the ultimate death work because it portrays sex as an end in itself, divorced from relationship and devoid of transcendence. And historical forgetfulness can be seen in the removal of statues and the renaming of buildings as examples of the annihilation of ideas and customs from the past. Then in part 2, The Foundations of the Revolution, Trueman traces the main historical threads. Chapter 3 focuses on the French writer Rousseau. He was the first person really to define his identity by looking within. His Confessions paved the way for the modern autobiography. For Rousseau, the real drama is the inner life. Unlike Augustine, who said that moral flaws are intrinsic because man is a sinner, Rousseau believed that corruption was created by society, that man's natural state is perfect. Freedom is found in following our inner voice. Chapter 4 then sets out to explain how the ideas of Rousseau reshaped wider culture through the movement known as Romanticism, especially the Romantic poets, and Trueman focuses on Wordsworth, Shelley and Blake. In many ways, Romanticism was a reaction to industrialization, with its emphasis on rural bliss and the poetic truths of nature. But you also find disdain for religion and a desire for sexual liberation in their writings. Chapter 5 is called The Emergence of Plastic People and considers the thought of Nietzsche, Marx and Darwin. What metaphysical framework has led to a society where identity can be made and remade? Nietzsche was the one who called the bluff of the Enlightenment and forced us to face the consequences of killing God. To destroy God is to remove the foundations upon which knowledge and morality are built. Knowledge is now rooted in power, and morality has become herd instinct. You have to become God yourself to create meaning, and so said Nietzsche. Marx applied Hegel's idea of human life as a state of becoming to society as a whole. For Marx, this process is material and political, and this is something that we come back to in later chapters. Darwin's contribution was to explain complex organisation and function without the need for God. Everything is a natural process, so humans have no special status and no special destiny. So the ideas of these three men now dominate the social imaginary. There's nothing special about us, there's no morality, and everything is political. So then to part 3, which focuses on the sexualization of the revolution. Chapter 6 is devoted to Freud, whose fingerprints are all over Western civilization, and even if his theories are false, they still grip the social imaginary. We all believe that sex is a key, or the key to a fulfilling human existence, and true happiness is defined as sexual satisfaction. That's thanks to Freud. In his theory of sexual development, children lose their innocence too. But it should be noted that Freud did not advocate uninhibited sexual license. He believed in sexual restraint, and the pleasure principle, as he called it, had to find other outlets for release, such as art or intoxicants. So Freud occupies a pivotal position in the sexualization of the self. Chapter 7 looks at the next stage, the politicization of sex. And here the argument is a little more complex. Essentially, the challenge facing the left has always been how to stir up class consciousness. It worked in Russia and led to revolution, but it hasn't in the West, mainly because of the welfare state. So two views emerged during the 20th century. In Italy, Gramsci said intellectuals should focus on schools and the media. Once the levers of power are in the right hands, revolution will come. By contrast, the Frankfurt School turned to Freud to understand the resilience of capitalism. Wilhelm Reich came to the conclusion that the problem is the patriarchal family. This is where the authoritarian state takes root. It causes people not to act in their own best interests, but to passively go along with the status quo. In this situation, sex education and sexual freedom are vital. They become the basis for political freedom. Class struggle is now seen as part of a wider struggle against repression. Sex isn't a private matter anymore because it's about identity. Reich's ideas were critiqued and developed by Herbert Marcuse. He said that sex that is focused on procreation is repressive. Free love is the key to revolution, and so sex is politicized. Oppression is not merely economic or political, it now relates to psychological identity. The old idea of liberal tolerance is a false consciousness. Education and speech need to be regulated to ensure the correct political outcomes. and in such a political climate, free speech becomes harmful. The other thread that Trueman discusses is feminism and its transformation from a movement concerned with economic matters to one that is concerned with the very notion of womanhood itself. Following de Beauvoir's famous line that one is not born but becomes a woman, we see the clear separation of gender and sex. Biology is a form of tyranny to be resisted and overcome with drugs and technology. For women to be free, they need the same rights as men, and that means promiscuity without penalty. Much of modern feminism wants to see the elimination of all genital differences and the destruction of the traditional family. Summing up part 3, Freud identified the powerful, motivating force of sex in our lives. With Reich and Marcuse, oppression becomes repression. To be free means to be sexually free, and to be happy means to be affirmed in that freedom. The final part of the book is called Triumphs of the Revolution. The first is the triumph of the erotic. Trueman identifies 2 key factors in this. First, surrealistic art that encouraged the belief that the most authentic self is the one detached from material life. And then the second factor is the pornification of mainstream culture. We've gone way beyond Playboy with extreme porn freely available on the internet. But the key thing is that porn detaches sex from actual interpersonal encounter and the logical endpoint of the sexual revolution. In the social imaginary of our world, sexual expression is the key to human flourishing. Chapter 9 traces the triumph of the therapeutic in all spheres of life, from the lecture room to the courtroom. It gives a number of examples of how expressive individualism is being worked out in the public sphere. He starts with the Supreme Court and the ruling to allow gay marriage based on a rereading of the Constitution. Then he discusses the ethics of Peter Singer, who follows his Nietzschean beliefs to their logical conclusion, denying that newborn babies and the mentally ill are authentic persons. Right and wrong in Singer's world comes down to psychological well-being. And then the third example he looks at is issues of free speech on student campuses and why it is considered dangerous. And finally, Trueman tackles the triumph of the T in chapter 10, where the T is transgenderism, as in LGBT. And thus the book comes full circle and addresses the question that was raised at the very beginning. For transgenderism to be coherent, society needs to place decisive priority on the psychological over the biological to determine identity. When Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn in 2015, he said that his life as a man was a lie, and that made him inauthentic. The question Trueman raises is, how does the T sit with L, G and B, which operate with gender binaries? Well, it's basically a political union committed to the elimination of gender norms. Trueman then looks a bit more deeply and sees conflict within the camp. Feminism pays a high price for its support of transgenderism, and the movement has fragmented over it. Germaine Greer argues that womanhood cannot be completely separated from biology. There is a female experience that Caitlyn Jenner can never have. Greer points out that a sex change for a man means the removal of male sex organs, but they can never be replaced with female ones. It's a deception. But Judith Butler rejects any biological basis for gender. True sexual revolution demands the end of the male-female binary. So we live in a world where the right to change your sex and gender is increasingly seen as a basic human right. And in the epilogue to part 4, Trueman states that no culture that has to justify itself without reference to a sacred order can survive. Degeneration or entropy is inevitable. In his concluding thoughts, Trueman says his book is not a lament, even though there is much to lament. The challenge for Christians living in this secular age means that we have to choose to be Christians in a way that people living in 1500, for example, did not. Belief was the default position then, but that is no longer the case. But he also says that we're all expressive individualists now. We're just the same. As Christians, we choose our church, our preferred worship style, our favourite preachers, and so on. That's not all bad, of course. All lives matter to God, Our equality is rooted in the doctrine of creation in the image of God. But because modern culture is not grounded in sacred order, we're heading towards totalitarian anarchy. The quintessential clash of the age will be between religious freedom and sexual identity. What then of the church? How should we respond? Trueman has 3 recommendations. Now, of course, a full response would require another book, so his comments are brief. First, he says, don't fight on the world's terms by appealing to experience alone. We need to engage from moral principles, not simply tell stories. Compassion rests on transcendent commitments. We need to remember that the Christian faith is dogmatic and doctrinal. We must keep speaking truth. Second, we need to be a community. Community is where identity is forged and confirmed. This will be vital to preserving a sense of Christian identity. And then third, Protestants need to recover a theology of the physical body, including a commitment to biblical sexual morality, whatever the cost. His final reflection is that the only historical precedent for our times is the 2nd century, when the church was a marginal sect within a dominant pluralist society. And how we live that out today is the challenge that we now face. So overall, this is an important book, but it's not for everyone. If you enjoy history, and especially the history of ideas, then you'll find it stimulating. But it's not an easy read, just simply because of the authors that he is engaging with. I'm just glad that he's done it for us. And so I do recommend The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman.